and no indications of homicide. She appeared healthy.
We are talking The Dead Girl in Apartment 3. This one is written and directed by Kurtis Spieler and stars Laura Dooling as a character called Laura. You've also got a supporting role from ADRIENNE King. Now, this to me is like the little movie that could. It's a low budget movie being put out by Wild Eye Releasing, and it's essentially a haunted house movie. It focuses on the character called Laura, who has recently moved to New York, and she's kind of, well, we understand she's been sharing this apartment with this kind of roommate, but she finds her body there one day, dead, obviously. And there's a kind of terrified look on her face. She calls the police, as she do. They kind of remove the body. They can't really see any obvious signs of kind of foul play or anything like that. But she's obviously understandably kind of shaken up. She doesn't really know anyone else in New York and is being a little bit creeped out. Now she's going to get more creeped out because we keep seeing that there's some type of presence within this kind of flat, and as the movie goes on we learn that things may be even worse than we initially kind of anticipated. And we have a few other characters that are introduced, her kind of ex-boyfriend, the police, things like this. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us talk what I think works with this movie. This is a film that I think definitely plays to its strengths. It's kind of a one location movie, all taking place within this kind of like this one kind of flat or apartment. But what I think this movie succeeds is a real kind of good sense of atmosphere. This movie is a creepy film. You know, it's a slower burn film, but in a movie like this, a haunted house film, that sense of ever kind of creeping dread, things are going to get more and more unsettling as the kind of the film progresses to a more of a overt crescendo towards the end of the movie. I think this movie does a great job of really building on the kind of the suspense, the atmosphere, and the kind of the tension through the movie, through initially kind of more subtle kind of means of strange goings on, but getting more kind of, overt as the kind of the film kind of progresses, and we learn more about what's kind of going on, and other kind of characters have a little bit more kind of interaction with Laura and kind of what's going on. I would say as well, I think the acting is actually fairly strong across the board here. Everyone is quite kind of subdued, and I think it works for the film. And obviously Laura, our main character, I think is suitably upset, does a good job of a quite realistic portrayal of someone who is understandably upset that they've kind of found their roommate dead, but it's not like she's been murdered and she's kind of like, oh my god, I'm fearing for my life, but that just kind of that general unease and that sort of feeling of being unsettled and things like that, I think it's really kind of palpable when you understand totally, how kind of freaked out she is and how she might kind of react to kind of certain things. I also thought the police that kind of interviewed her did a good job of kind of some nice kind of like believable kind of character work. You feel like you kind of get a little bit of a sense of who they are. They're not just kind of like, faceless kind of cops who we kind of see that kind of come in and then go. You do actually get a sense that, what is kind of their personalities and things like that. I also quite like the way that there's not a kind of a B plot where they think she's kind of like responsible. She's kind of, it's pretty obvious that she didn't really have anything to do with it necessarily, because there's no real signs of forced entry or wounds or anything like that. So, but it's just a kind of a nice take on these officers with a little bit of character work. Our male officer seems like he might be a little bit kind of romantically interested, things like that. And our female officers kind of like warning them off, stuff like that. I thought there was some good character work, and I think every actor here does a pretty good job of portraying their characters in kind of believable roles. The movie is a slow burn, but I do think it gives you enough to kind of keep you interested. I think it really works in the movie's favour, certainly in regards to kind of having this kind of like this uneasy tone, this kind of creepiness kind of factor. And considering this is a more or less a one location movie, we get, you know, a few shots outside and with the police and stuff here and there. But, you know, it's a pretty good kind of like well lit movie, and kind of, despite the fact this isn't a huge property, you know, it's lit in a way and filmed in a certain way where I think it kind of, you know, it can feel genuinely kind of creepy, even though there's nothing kind of like, you know, overtly kind of there, which is obviously creepy, at least initially. Effects wise, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I won't lie, there is kind of an effect of possibly something else, which I don't know if it worked really well, but the actual kind of ghostly effects, again, it's not done to a high budget standard, but for what it's trying to do, I actually think it looks quite menacing and kind of looks quite creepy. It's a lot of kind of like things kind of being somewhat obscured or kind of slightly out of view, but it works well, again, in kind of context of the film. I get the impression here that our kind of writer-director knows his limitations and kind of what he can and can't do, and I think makes the absolute best of his kind of budget and his actors here to make a compelling story where, as the film kind of goes on, we learn that there's maybe kind of, you know, more at foot than we initially anticipated. So you keep engaged, but it's kind of not trying to do anything too kind of like too clever. It's, you know, it layers in a few kind of extra kind of things as the film goes on. But it's not trying to overexert itself in and being too over-ambitious and can't kind of handle the kind of the requirements. I think it's a very well-measured film, very kind of like well-made and quite confident style of kind of direction, I will say. Okay, so what doesn't work? This is not a spoiler because it's literally the first thing in the movie. But this trope, there's a couple of, you can hear me say trope a couple of times here, because unfortunately this movie does have some, and maybe it's the fact that, you know, it's a lower budget film with a director with that huge kind of like, you know, list of films underneath his belt, but there are a couple of typical things that happens, and I'm going to tell you about two of them. Number one, we have that scene at the beginning of the film where we see a character being interviewed by the police about what has happened, and he gives some information, and then the police say, again, this is right at the beginning of the film, this isn't spoiling for you. So, well, there's a girl missing, and there's 3 bodies. So we, at the very beginning of the movie, know there's going to be at least 3 bodies in the movie, and presumably our main girl is going to go missing. And so when we're there, and it's not a big cast, we are waiting for these things to happen. And I do not understand why filmmakers insist on having this kind of like flash forward at the beginning of the movie, because it absolutely undercuts the tension, because you know what is roughly is going to happen before you've even watched the film. I cannot understand why filmmakers do this. And it's not like it's this one-off thing that only happens. It happens quite a lot. It seems so counterproductive to me. I cannot understand why filmmakers insist on having this. And if you're gonna have a scene which takes place much later on, don't give stuff away. Don't tell people there's 3 bodies and there's a girl that's missing. You know, and I wouldn't have said that unless it's literally the first thing you see. So there's that. In other reviews that I've done, I've mentioned a trope that happens quite a lot in especially haunting films. Now, as I'm sitting here, you can see I've got a void, right? And that's normally where I put images of the poster and things like that. But in horror films, if we have a void, we know something's going to appear there. And that's fair enough, you know, that's just kind of setting up the shot. That in itself is a little bit of a trope, but there you go. But that's not the one I'm talking about. The trope I've often mentioned is where a character is looking at the screen like I am to you. You know, they're doing something where they're facing, you know, away, you know, towards you as the audience, and you kind of get a ghost or something walking around in the background, and then they turn around and the ghost is gone. Now think about it. Why is if the ghost is clearly invisible when they turn around, why is that they're appearing when they can't see? Who is that appearing for? Us as the audience, who are not meant to be there. This is not like we're meant to be a person who's like facing our kind of a main character. Why is there a spirit making themselves visible when no one is looking? It just doesn't make sense to me. And then when someone turns around and they're gone, it's just like one of these tropes that keeps happening. And boy, Does it happen in this movie? Not once, not twice, 3 times or more this happens in this movie. It is like, oh, this shot is being used over and over again, or a shot very much like it. So again, maybe it's a little bit of inexperience from the director here, using that same kind of like filming technique over and over again in the kind of the same movie. Maybe once I wouldn't complain about it, but at least 3 times I counted it. It could even be more. 3 times I certainly noticed it. It doesn't make sense in a narrative sense, in a narrative sense, story-wise, and it's just a very tried and tested kind of like shot that doesn't, that appears in so many films and doesn't make sense when you think about it. Okay, there's those 2 kind of things. What else can I say that doesn't work in this film? I have to say, I think this movie is building a great atmosphere through the film. We get to our final sequences, I would say the second half of the third act, and I don't think it quite sticks the landing. Something else is kind of revealed. In particular, it revealed itself to our character's ex-boyfriend. It doesn't make sense to me in a narrative sense. If we are following the rules that this movie sets out, there's no story reason why this is happening. It doesn't really make any sense to me. So I think the movie is quite consistent in its kind of lore until we kind of get to that kind of third act where it just seems to do things because the story kind of wants it to. It doesn't really. Is thinking, how is this character interacting with this? It doesn't make sense. There's been no kind of like setup for that. There's no reason for it. It's a little weak, I have to say. And then we see the ghost, but we see something else as well. And again, it's a little bit of a weak source and of kind of a visual kind of level there. And we are introduced to kind of like motivations, shall we say, in the kind of the final act of the movie. And again, it's a little bit of exposition, a little bit too heavy on the exposition for me, I found. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the ending to me, where it's trying to kind of make sense of what's happening, give you some of the answers, it didn't quite land for me in kind of certain aspects. And even the visual, what happens, is again on a little the weaker side, especially if you watch into the credits where you will see a stinger. Get rid of that, because that is terrible. That's a terrible stinger, to be honest. Post-credit scene, horrible. That really undercuts some of the kind of the good work that has been done up until this point. Outside of that, I think maybe people will be put off possibly by the slower pace. For me it worked, but I will say it's a slower paced film. But I think it works in the context of a haunting film, to be honest. But I gotta say, overall, I did enjoy this movie. It was an engaging storyline with likeable, realistic characters and a spooky atmosphere, and quite well shot. I do think maybe the script could have been better, if I'm honest. My critiques could have come down to that, and maybe not relying on quite so many kind of like cliches and tropes that this kind of movie does. But overall, it's well worth your time if you don't mind a lower budget kind of haunting movie. But it's certainly a great calling card for this kind of writer, director, and the cast, to be fair. Because I think everyone here does a pretty admirable job, and I honestly can't see anyone saying this is a bad movie in any kind of real aspect. I honestly don't think it is. It has its flaws, but I think most people would agree that this is probably a good movie, at least, or an average movie. But I think it's pretty good. I want to give it a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.